Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
In the freezing, rarefied air of the stratosphere, at 30,000 feet above the hostile landscape of occupied Europe, the war was not a cacophony of artillery or the roar of a tank engine, but a silent, solitary, terrifying hum of a single Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This was the domain of the photographic reconnaissance (PR) pilot, the men who flew the most dangerous missions of the Second World War not because they carried the most bombs, but because they carried none. To understand the granular history of the air war, one must look away from the B-17 formations and the dogfighting Spitfires and focus on the singular blue-painted aircraft moving like ghosts through the upper atmosphere. These pilots operated under a unique and terrifying doctrine. Their only defense was speed, their only armor was altitude, and their payload was not high explosives, but fragile rolls of celluloid film that held the secrets of the Third Reich. The job of the PR pilot was a paradox of modern warfare. They were the most vital strategic asset, yet they were required to be entirely passive in the face of aggression, forbidden to engage, ordered to run, and subjected to a level of psychological isolation that broke men as effectively as enemy fire. The genesis of this high-risk discipline lies in the realization by British intelligence, specifically the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and the RAF, that traditional observation was obsolete in the face of modern anti-aircraft defenses. The slow, lumbering biplanes of World War I could no longer survive over targets protected by heavy flak and fast monoplane fighters. The solution, pioneered by the maverick aviator Sidney Cotton, was radical: strip a high-performance fighter of all its weaponry, all its armor plating, and even its radio, polish the surface to reduce drag, and fill the empty spaces with extra fuel tanks and high-resolution cameras. This birthed the PR Spitfire and later the PR Mosquito, machines designed for one purpose: to fly higher and faster than anything the Luftwaffe could put in the sky. However, this engineering marvel stripped the pilot of his agency. When a PR pilot strapped into his cockpit, he was accepting a contract of vulnerability. If he was intercepted, he could not fight back. He sat on hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, behind a camera lens, knowing that a single incendiary round from a Messerschmitt would turn his aircraft into a funeral pyre. The operational reality of these flights was a test of human physiological endurance as much as piloting skill. Flying at altitudes often exceeding 30,000 or even 40,000 feet, the pilots existed in a world of lethal cold. The cockpit heating systems were notoriously unreliable, often diverted to keep the camera lenses from frosting over, leaving the pilot to suffer frostbite in temperatures plunging to -50 degrees Celsius. In this frozen solitude, the greatest enemy was not always the Germans, but the air itself. Condensation trails, or contrails, were the PR pilot's betrayal. At certain altitudes, the hot exhaust from the engine would crystallize instantly, painting a giant white arrow across the blue sky that pointed directly to the aircraft. A pilot had to be constantly vigilant, checking his rear-view mirror not just for enemy fighters, but for the telltale white stream. If he saw it, he had to frantically change altitude, diving or climbing to find air where the physics of condensation would not give him away. This constant management of the aircraft's atmospheric signature required an intuitive understanding of meteorology, all while navigating by dead reckoning over a continent where all road signs had been removed and cities were blacked out. The dicing missions represented the other end of the suicidal spectrum. While high-altitude photography provided the strategic map, the location of factories, the layout of cities, it often lacked the texture required for tactical planning. To know the angle of a radar dish, the thickness of a concrete wall, or the type of beach obstacle awaiting an invasion force, the camera had to get close. This meant flying on the deck. Pilots in Spitfires or P-38 Lightnings would drop from the safety of the clouds to treetop level, accelerating to nearly 400 miles per hour. The sensation of speed at this altitude was overwhelming, the ground rushing by as a blur. The danger here was immediate and violent. Light flak, 20mm and 37mm cannons, and even small arms fire from terrified soldiers on the ground would erupt in a wall of lead. The pilot had to hold the aircraft steady, fighting the turbulence and the instinct to jink, because a steady platform was required for the cameras to overlap their images correctly. A dicing run over a heavily defended target like a radar station or AV weapon site meant flying straight down the throat of the enemy guns, the pilot watching the tracer rounds arc toward his windshield, unable to return fire, waiting for the shutter to click. The psychological burden of the PR pilot was unique in the annals of military aviation. Bomber crews had each other. Fighter pilots had wingmen. The PR pilot flew alone. This total isolation for hours on end, deep inside enemy territory, created a specific kind of mental strain known as the loneliness of the long-distance flyer. There was no radio chatter to break the tension, no one to watch your 6. If a mechanical failure occurred over Bavaria or Poland, there was no hope of rescue. If the engine coughed, the silence that followed was the loudest sound in the world. This solitude bred a distinct personality type, eccentric, highly individualistic, and meticulously detailed. They were the introverts of the Air Force, men who could tolerate the silence and maintain a hyper state of alertness without external stimulation. They were also the men who carried the burden of the one-way ticket. The loss rates in PR units were often staggeringly high, not in absolute numbers compared to Bomber Command, but in percentage. In the early days of the war, the life expectancy of a PR pilot was measured in weeks. The technology of the cameras themselves added another layer of complexity to the pilot's workload. The aircraft were fitted with F-24 and F-52 cameras, massive pieces of optical machinery with focal lengths ranging from 8 inches to 36 inches. The pilot had to be a photographer as well as an aviator. He had to manage the intervalometer, the device that timed the shutter releases to ensure the photos overlapped by exactly 60% to allow for stereoscopic, 3D, analysis back in England. If he flew too fast or too slow, the overlap would be wrong, and the interpreters would see a distorted world. If he banked the aircraft at the wrong moment, the photo would be oblique and useless for scaling. He had to calculate the sun angle to ensure shadows provided depth but didn't obscure the target. A mission could be physically successful, the pilot returns alive, but an intelligence failure if the camera settings were slightly off. The pressure to return with the goods was immense. A failed photo run meant the mission had to be flown again, doubling the risk. The strategic impact of this singular job was the fulcrum upon which the entire Allied war effort rested. It is no exaggeration to say that without the PR pilots, the strategic bombing campaign would have been a blind man flailing in the dark. The Battle of the Beams and the destruction of German industry relied on the post-strike assessment provided by reconnaissance. When the Allies sought to destroy the German synthetic oil plants, it was the PR photos that revealed which smokestacks were still active and which buildings were mere shells. When the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets began to threaten London, it was the keen eyes of interpreters like Constance Babington Smith, analyzing films brought back by pilots who had risked their lives over Peenman Day, who identified the small, curving launch rails. Operation Crossbow, the campaign to destroy these weapons, was entirely driven by the daily intake of film. The pilot who flew that mission didn't drop a bomb that destroyed a launch site. He brought back the coordinates that allowed 1,000 bombers to destroy it. One of the most harrowing aspects of the job was the pursuit by the Luftwaffe. In the early years, the Spitfire PR variants could outclimb and outrun the Me-109. But as German engineering advanced, the gap narrowed. The introduction of the Focke-Wulf 190, and later the jet-powered Me-262, changed the equation. The Me-262, with its blistering speed, negated the PR Spitfire's primary defense. For a PR pilot to see a jet in his mirror was a death sentence. He could not dive to escape, as the jet was faster in a dive. He could not outclimb it. His only hope was to turn inside it, using the Spitfire's tighter turning radius to play a desperate game of cat and mouse until he could reach cloud cover or the enemy ran out of fuel. The transcripts of encounters between unarmed Spitfires and German jets are chilling records of helplessness, where the pilot's skill was the only thing standing between him and annihilation. The contribution of the American Army Air Forces, USAAF, in the P-38 Lightning brought a different dynamic. The F-4 and F-5 reconnaissance variants of the P-38 were fast, twin-engine monsters with long range, but they suffered from distinct technical issues. The vibration of the engines often blurred the photographs, requiring constant engineering adjustments. Furthermore, the P-38's silhouette was distinctive, and at high altitudes, its contrails were thick. American PR pilots, flying from bases in England and Italy, undertook some of the longest missions of the war, shuttling to Russia or deep into the Balkans, Operation Frantic. These missions tested the endurance of the human body to its limit, requiring pilots to sit in a cramped, freezing cockpit for 7 or 8 hours, managing fuel mixtures and navigation while constantly scanning for the glint of enemy wings. The symbiotic relationship between the pilot in the air and the photographic interpreter, PI, on the ground is a crucial element of this history. The pilot risked his life to expose the film. The PI risked their eyesight and sanity to extract the truth from it. At the Allied Central Interpretation Unit, ACIU, at RAF Medmenham, millions of photos were analyzed. The pilot was the hunter, but the PI was the butcher who dressed the kill. The feedback loop was tight. A pilot would land, cold and stiff, and the film magazines would be rushed to the developers. Within hours, an interpreter would be looking at the grain of the image, perhaps spotting a camouflaged tank division in the Ardennes or a new type of radar array on the French coast. If the photos were blurred or the target missed, the pilot felt a personal sense of failure. The bond between the air crews and the ground crews was intense, forged in the knowledge that the intelligence they produced was saving thousands of lives on the ground. The preparation for D-Day, Operation Overlord, was the PR pilot's magnum opus and his most dangerous hour. For months, they mapped every inch of the Normandy coast. They had to fly at low tide and high tide, capturing the beach gradients and the underwater obstacles. These missions were flown in the face of a fully alerted Atlantic wall. The Germans knew the Allies were watching, and they reinforced their flak batteries accordingly. The dicing sorties over Omaha and Utah beaches were flown at heights so low that pilots returned with salt spray on their windscreens and tree branches in their radiators. They brought back the images of the Rommel's asparagus, wooden stakes, and the steel hedgehogs that would have ripped the bottom out of the landing craft. Without these photos, the invasion would have likely failed. The pilots flew these missions knowing that the secrecy of the invasion depended on them not being shot down and captured with their maps. They were carrying the date and location of the greatest secret of the war in their flight paths. The technological arms race of aerial reconnaissance also birthed the innovation of night photography. Flying alone in the dark, using flash bombs to illuminate the target, was a terrifying proposition. The pilot had to navigate by the stars or primitive radar, locate a specific factory in a blacked-out Europe, release a magnesium flash bomb, and time the camera shutter to the millisecond of the explosion. The flash was so bright it blinded the pilot temporarily, leaving him dazzled and disoriented in the pitch black, an easy target for night fighters. These night owls provided crucial evidence of the effectiveness of RAF Bomber Command's night raids, proving whether the target had been hit or if the bombers had been lured away by German decoy fires. We must also consider the machinery of the aircraft itself as a character in this drama. The PR Spitfire, particularly the Mark 11 and Mark 19, was a masterpiece of aerodynamics. Mechanics would wax and polish the wings to gain an extra few miles per hour. The removal of the guns shifted the center of gravity, making the aircraft handle differently, lighter, more responsive, but also more fragile. The addition of the slipper tank, an external fuel tank, extended the range but added drag. The pilot had to decide when to drop the tank. Drop it too early, and you don't make it home. Drop it too late, and you can't outrun the interceptor. Every flight was a series of mathematical calculations involving fuel consumption, wind speed, and altitude, performed by a hypoxic brain in a freezing metal box. The end of the war did not end the danger. In the final months, as the Allies pushed into Germany, the PR pilots were tasked with locating the shifting front lines and the retreating German columns. The chaos of the collapsing Reich meant that flak could come from anywhere. The skies were filled with desperate Luftwaffe pilots flying the last of their machines. And then, there was the discovery of the concentration camps. It was often the gun cameras and the reconnaissance cameras that provided the first visual evidence of the atrocities, capturing the layout of Bergen-Belsen or Dachau from the air before the ground troops arrived. These images, devoid of tactical utility, became the historical record of genocide. The legacy of the World War II PR pilot is often overshadowed by the fighter aces and the bomber crews. Yet, their contribution was arguably more decisive. They were the eyes of the giant. They flew unarmed into the teeth of the enemy, relying on nerve and skill. They proved that information was a weapon as lethal as any bomb. The most dangerous job was not defined by the number of kills, but by the sheer, naked vulnerability of the act. To fly straight and level while people try to kill you, to resist the urge to fight back, to trust in the speed of your machine and the steadiness of your hand. This required a specific, quiet kind of courage that is the hallmark of the reconnaissance pilot. They were the lonely sentinels of the stratosphere, watching the world burn from 30,000 feet, capturing the horror and the heroism on rolls of silver nitrate, ensuring that when history looked back, it would not be blind. The silence of their cockpit was the crucible in which the intelligence of the war was forged.